which embodied these and other principles. And so we go on with all sorts of law that can be relevant to this particular field. There are the laws on human rights, the still emergent laws on human rights, which Professor Dinnerstein has described so eloquently. There is the general criminal law. If I harm you in one way or another, seriously, I may deserve to go to prison under that law. And to say nothing of all the international laws that exist and are on the way here, the oldest ones in our field being those on psychotropic substances, the conventions that are intended to bind the whole world, and which originally were formulated to deal with the trade in opium, but of course since then have been expanded to deal at various levels with a whole range of psychotropic medicines. Now, many of these rules and principles that relate to law and drugs are really very ancient when you look back. In the 14th century, in Vienna, Austria, the authorities decreed, for example, that false apothecaries must be thrown out of their premises and their bottles with them. We don't do things quite that way nowadays, but the whole principle is there. We want to protect ourselves and society as a whole against the harm that can be done by drugs. I want to look now very briefly at two fields of psychiatry and the drugs that are used in those. Firstly, I shall look quickly at the history of the benzodiazepines, which is sufficiently old now, 50 years, for us to analyze what has really happened with that class of drugs. And then we shall look more briefly at the current generation of antidepressant drugs, the SSRIs, and try to assess how adequately society has reacted and could have reacted to those particular groups of drugs in order to protect itself and its members. Now, the first benzodiazepine tranquilizer, Librium, chlordiazepoxide, was launched by the Swiss multinational Hoffmann-La Roche exactly 50 years ago this year, in 1956. It was quite simply, and setting aside all the hyperbole that was distributed about it, it was a sensation. And it remains, in retrospect, a sensation. Doctors and patients had been calling for sedatives of one sort or another throughout the history of medicine. But opium had proved to cause serious addiction. The bromides had done the same, as well as causing physical symptoms. The barbiturates were by that time proving to cause very serious and widespread addiction, and were also proving to be ideal instruments for committing suicide, which is not exactly what one wants in a patient who's already depressed. And now here came Librium, followed by a host of congeners that appeared to provide ideal protection from nervousness, day or night, without bringing with it serious risks. That was apparently the picture that we had at that particular time, and without causing excessive sedation. It reminded very many people of the fictitious drug Soma, described by Aldous Huxley in his novel Brave New World, a product that would surround the individual with a sort of cocoon of tranquility and contentment without impairing his function in any serious way. So it's no wonder that doctors were very soon, advertising or no advertising, proving to use this drug in a vast number of patients, whether they needed it or not. And you see, everyone laughs when I say that. But look back to the advertising of 1956, and you will find one advertisement which has the headline, "Whatever the indication, Librium." So the doctors were giving this to patients who were perhaps nervous, perhaps anxious, or who might possibly become nervous or anxious because of their illness or because of their doctors. It was very serious, because by 1970 some writers were estimating that something like a third of the working population of New York was chronically taking Librium or one of its congeners. Now, for a long time, you only had occasional quiet expressions of concern that this group of drugs had become a component of absolutely normal life, and this could not possibly be a good thing, that people couldn't put their finger on exactly what the risks might be. Society therefore accepted the situation, and there was no legal or other significant challenge to it at the time. It's probably fair to say that when concern did begin to arise, it arose as a result of several specific events, and I want to look back at two of those events. The first, during the 60s and 70s, was the progressive emergence of evidence that these drugs were indeed also causing true dependence. There was a great deal of wordplay and whitewashing, with people distinguishing addiction from dependence, dependence from habituation. And much of that debate was, I'm afraid, intended from certain sides to minimize the problem, to mask the problem, to play it down. But the fact was that many people who had no long-term need for a benzodiazepine continued to take it for almost unlimited periods, because having been given it, perhaps justifiably, in an acute situation such as a bereavement, they became entirely dependent upon it mentally and to some degree physically. That led to real concern in a new area, that these drugs might actually be impairing mental and physical achievement in some way. It was suggested that they were inhibiting any stimulus to self-betterment and ambition, and that we would end up with a mediocre, self-satisfied society, just such as Aldous Huxley had predicted in 1930. Now, while that debate continued, some other events occurred, and I want to quote one of them. In 1979, the Upjohn Company of Kalamazoo marketed a modified benzodiazepine, a triazolobenzodiazepine, triazolam, known commercially as Halcyon, and sold initially in doses of up to 1 milligram. And within a very short period of time, reports began to circulate of users experiencing very severe mental reactions. They included confusion, paranoia, hostility, aggression, sometimes proceeding to suicidal and even murderous behavior. In the Netherlands, a very small country, that problem was recognized for the first time because it was one of the very first countries in which that drug had been introduced. It was not a typical benzodiazepine. Structurally, it was slightly different. It had a remarkable metabolism to the extent that it had no active metabolites, that it remained in the bloodstream at an active level only for a very short period and then dropped suddenly away. The activity dropped just like that. The drug was promptly suspended in the Netherlands, and 6 months later its license for sale was withdrawn. And several other countries where people had looked askance at what was happening there, what had these stupid people in Holland been doing with this perfectly good drug, similar action was taken. Progressively that drug in its original form disappeared, only to reappear many years later in a much lower dose. There was also a civil law reaction, with cases being brought against the manufacturer for not having warned about this particular type of effect. That process culminated in this country in a number of cases, including the spectacular case of Grundberg versus Upjohn. That case, brought by a lady who had, under the influence of Halcyon, shot her mother 8 times through the head, a mother to whom she was absolutely devoted, pinpointed the fact that something very, very serious was happening with this product and could happen perhaps with other types of product. In retrospect, it does seem that the problem of Halcyon was due entirely to this rapid disappearance from the blood, this drop without leaving active metabolites behind, as a result of which the entire system was shaken up and deranged. People could begin to behave peculiarly in the night, with sleepwalking and odd behavior, or in the day that followed, or both. The traditional benzodiazepines, after all, had a whole series of active metabolites which declined slowly in the blood over a series of days. But these reactions had been reported too, incidentally, as early as 1958, with some of the earlier